Hello everyone, I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes before we start, give people a chance to arrive. Okay, right then. And we'll get started and let everyone trickle in as they come. So, hi everybody, and welcome to this live stream event on the science behind stress. I'm David Plants. I'm the CEO and founder of BioBeats. For those of you who don't know, BioBeats builds digital well-being products to improve people's mental health. And I've spent the best part of the last 2 decades researching how bodies and minds store and respond to stress and trauma. I did that first in artificial intelligence. This is where I originally came from as a researcher. And then a life event that I'll cover later on prompted me to retrain as a neuroscientist. And now I work within the Social Cognition Lab at Oxford, as well as the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's national body for artificial intelligence. Within BioBeats, our purpose is to understand how to predict mental disorder, but also personally, my objective is to understand how to treat it. So predict and treat, and using AI to do that. We're now in week 7 of lockdown, and I wonder how everyone feels. So many of you here today, including myself and those in my team, are learning how to cope during this time. And not only are we having to adapt to being in confinement, but we're training ourselves to survive without any regular interaction with other people, physically, visually, verbally. And these circumstances have a tremendous impact on our happiness, on our health, and our well-being. There's plenty of emerging scientific evidence to show that if we don't manage these changes well, then our health is going to suffer. So one example is the Lancet review paper on the psychological and physiological impact of quarantine, published on March 14th, which outlined the ways in which quarantine can make people suffer. The separation from loved ones and the loss of freedom, loss of liberty, uncertainty over disease status, and boredom can create a lot of suffering. On April 30th, Nature published a perspective paper on how we might use social and behavioral science to support a COVID-19 pandemic response, where the authors, all of whom were from major psychology departments all over the world, outlined several challenges the pandemic offers us in decision-making, in leadership, for stress, and for coping. And again, they outlined that social distancing clashes with our deep-seated human instinct to connect with others. Loneliness and isolation make stress worse and can have a really bad effect, not only on mental, but on cardiovascular and immune health. And we all need the latter very much right now. So it's unintuitive, right? And whilst you might think that enhanced online interaction might help us connect with others, and it can, enhanced use of social media, for example, doesn't contribute to one's sense of actual social connection. And so why is that? And clearly, we can't avoid stress altogether. The global pandemic is not something you can avoid or control. So the prolonged stress of it will have an effect. Stress affects the body from head to toe. And so when something scary happens, stress hormones set your heart racing, and they make you break into cold sweats. This is the fight or flight response. But if those hormones stay elevated for a long time, if you stay in that response mode over time, they can cause inflammation in the body, and that can lead to lasting health problems. So it's in fact not the amount of stress that matters, it's our mindset. In other words, it's not what happens that can hurt us, but our reaction to what happens. Now that sounds pretty simple, and I know that that it's harder to actually put in place the understanding of the fact that mindset can change one's physiological resilience to stress, but it can. Now, I know that some of you are not only responsible for your own well-being, but also that of others, including colleagues and team members. And so whether you're an employer looking after your team or an individual looking to understand your health, the topics I'll discuss today are going to be applicable to both. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to share some insights and evidence that we've learned over the last few years in capturing data from thousands of people and understanding and working with organizations on how to deal with mental health in the workplace, but also what mental health means generally. So I'll share insights and evidence into how our bodies and minds react to this new reality and what we can do to help them right now, from physiological regulation to prolonged rumination and what it means and what worry can do. So then I'll wrap up with some advice for taking care of your own mental health during this time, as well as that of others. So let's talk about lifestyle first. Every part of our lives is now happening at home, from work to school to socializing with friends and family and being physically active. And for those of us who have teenage children, for example, we get a lot more physical interaction than we used to with them, which can be good and bad. And for those of us who live alone, we are not having any social interaction at the physical level. We're in a state of confinement. And that, as human beings, is not something we evolved to deal with. So if you look back at human evolution and how our nervous system evolved to have the limbs it has, the sort of eyes that we have that are front-facing, not side-facing, we adapted to hunt and to survive. We used to have physically demanding lifestyles, and our behaviors meant solving problems in real time, such as predator invasion, searching for food, finding a mate, hunting. And while human nature has evolved and the human condition has evolved, these qualities remained deeply ingrained. So when we take away basic functions, such as interacting with people and responding to visual cues, we become vulnerable, both psychologically as well as physically. So we're currently suppressing our evolutionary intelligence, and this has a cost. It erodes our confidence in ourselves and in other people, particularly because other people are now a threat. This erosion of confidence will take some time to fix. We'll need to rebuild trust. Now, we're much more physically resilient to stress when we're in our natural environment, that is, our hunter and gatherer ancestor environment, and the modern versions of that we've become accustomed to, like cities and offices and public transport and so on. This is because of a phenomenon called stress-related growth, whereby stressful experiences serve to increase physiological toughening. But that only happens under the right conditions and under the right mindset. So not all stress is bad. Now, I personally suffered from poor mental health early in my career, and it led me to burn out and eventually suffer a cardiac arrest. And it came without any warning. And so why did it happen? I was fairly young, but my blood pathology at the time showed that I had become extremely malnourished. So stress had essentially made me forget my body, and I forgot to eat. That and serious lack of sleep over several years had brought my body to a crashing halt. I had no warning because all of my symptoms were completely physical, and I couldn't perceive them. So I never made the link between physical ill health and the fact that it could be caused by my mental health. So I was just focused on working, and I overworked myself to death, essentially. This is known in societies where work ethic goes overboard, such as in Japan, where they have a literal word for it, karoshi, meaning death from overwork and starvation. The fact that we can starve ourselves to death, surrounded by supermarkets, says everything about how important the body is in the relationship between physical and mental health. It's one of our greatest misconceptions about mental health. We've been conditioned to believe that it's simply a cognitive experience, that we are brains, and we're not. In fact, it has far more to do with our bodies, the interplay between body and mind. So if we can better understand what's happening inside our bodies, then together we can more effectively and safely navigate these turbulent times. So that includes managing symptoms that come with confinement and social isolation. And some of them you may already be experiencing, like headaches or feeling low or depressed or perhaps anxious, more sweaty than usual. You might be getting signals from your body that you haven't really paid attention to before. So what can you do about that? We need to firstly understand how to regulate our physiological functioning. That means connecting with our bodies through touch, taking a walk, dancing, breathing. Have you ever noticed that you come up with new ideas whilst walking or in the shower? Both are related to movement and increased levels of oxygen. It's no coincidence. There are neuroscientific reasons behind this. Our current understanding of mental health imagines that everything is about the mind. We've taken a cerebral approach to understanding mental suffering, but the evidence is clear that the drama of the mind can cause physical symptoms, from eczema to cardiovascular issues to non-biologically induced paralysis. If you're particularly interested in this area of how the body stores stress, I recommend a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. That's Kolk, which looks at how our emotional processes, such as trauma and mental health illnesses, are stored in the body, how our body plays a role. Our bodies are so much more important for mental health than we think. They're not just bound to our reality, they're also marked by social rules. Different societies use bodily actions or gestures differently. Our gestures physically have different meanings in different societies. We adorn and transform our bodies and inhabit them in ways that completely transcend our DNA. Our social space, usually full of interactions face-to-face, is now FaceTime and Zoom, where the social nature of our bodies is boxed up and limited and translated into a sort of mute interaction. What we do with our eyes when we speak to each other face-to-face is almost impossible to do in Zoom, because nobody ever really looks at the camera. They're looking at the picture of. So that drives us to pay even less attention to our bodies. And that lack of attention, that lack of corporeal attention, that lack of attention to our bodies makes us suffer more. Our response to stress, in the absence of the usual cues of work and place and travel and social interaction, can turn into a permanent state of worry. And as human beings, we find it easy to dwell, which is fine. We like thinking and solving problems, and that's okay until it turns into rumination. And rumination is the process of continuously thinking the same thought over and over. It's like having the same song going around and around in your mind. Often, this can be triggered by the stress of a traumatic event. But when we talk about trauma here, this can be seemingly small things, like receiving a bad email or not being able to meet a deadline. Not all trauma needs to be massive childhood events. The word is really overused. Tiny bits of trauma, tiny bits of emotional conflict, tiny challenges to our mental health litter our everyday. We cope with most of them just fine. But in a ruminative state, in a state of permanent worry, in a state where there is an imposed state of worry, we cope less well. and the bits of trauma accumulate. And they accumulate in the body. So whilst we are in confinement and later when we return, but other waves of COVID-19 force us to distance, again, rumination will be much more common for many of us. And it can have some scary effects on our bodies. It can change the way our heart beats, literally. And there's evidence showing an association between rumination itself and cardiovascular disease. We've published some of that evidence in the Frontiers Journal of Human Neuroscience. So we need to find new ways to connect with our bodies to survive what's going on. So between the mind and the body, we're seeing and experiencing potentially harmful effects as a result of the pandemic. And again, if we don't carefully manage those, they could become quite dangerous. For a start, the effect that it will have on healthcare services and occupational health and human resources is going to be felt for a number of years. And if we don't strategize for that, then we'll always be in a reactive mode that simply will not serve the need. We're also seeing an underlying battle between the brain directing our bodies and our physiological reactions to stress, which usually happen subconsciously and relate to our gut and our heart. The results of the trauma caused by this pandemic will likely give rise to a wave of PTSD, just like war does. And we will need to have long-term mental health strategies in place. In a study published earlier this year in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, epidemiologists investigated the mental health effects of protests, of riots, of revolutions. And their work looked at the immediate effects of these events, as well as their long-term consequences. Their work looked at the immediate effects, but also the consequences. They found that the prevalence of depression and PTSD among populations after collective actions like protests and riots is comparable to levels experienced after natural disasters and terrorist attacks. And this was the case for populations directly and indirectly affected by such events, which suggests a sort of spillover effect. This means that anxiety over a disruptive event ripples through communities. Similar effects happen after natural disasters, where mental health consequences can include depression, PTSD, and substance use disorders. It's probably why the shelves at supermarkets are empty of toilet paper, but also a lot of alcohol has gone missing. It's very probable that we'll see this here too, a wave of PTSD. But this isn't anything new. We know that we have a mental health problem. Even as a nation in the UK, we have a known mental health problem. If you think about the rate of prevalence of mental disorder, people assume that it's small, but it's more like 1 in 4. In China, it's 1 in 3. The US has a similar prevalence rate. We now have an opportunity to address an issue which has been around for many, many years. And until now, it was considered a bit player, a secondary consideration. Among all the other things that needed to be taken care of in any organization, mental health was something that people knew they had to deal with, but didn't really understand the magnitude or how to implement a well-being program was comprehensive enough. This is a chance to re-examine that. It's a chance to re-examine what it means to take care of mental health overall. Susie Orbach wrote an article today in The Guardian where she said that a societal trauma gives us opportunities for people to go through things together rather than suffer alone. In my opinion, this is a chance to redefine how we work. It's not just about mental health overall. It's an opportunity to redefine how we work with each other, how we practice occupational health, and how we manage human resources to take care of people, to put mental health first. It's an enormous opportunity for change. Now, as I draw this to an end, I'd like to share a few tips for you to take away. Firstly, don't think of mental health as mental. Think of it as health. The body is the host for our thoughts, and thoughts happen in the body as much as they happen in the brain. The most important part of you is physical reality. Listen to your gut and your heart. Spend a bit of time each day just trying to feel what's going on in there and acknowledging the pulsing and breathing that goes on, the aches and pains, maybe the tiredness, or the springiness. Find a bit of compassion in there. The usual advice is to drink water and eat the right food and prioritize sleep and daily exercise, and that's all wonderful and true advice. But some equally important good habits are to get sunlight early on in the day, which resets your circadian clock, to find places where you can look far away and gaze, which satiates the hunter part of your body and nervous system, and then to walk, shake it off, dance, do some yoga or whatever you find on YouTube that makes you move and laugh. As an employer, you have new responsibilities. It's time to change practices, pathways to referral, and to consider how you support your people from healthy to just coping, and then generalized anxiety, and then depression. And as we've seen in data over the last year, also suicidal ideation. It's not something anyone wants to talk about, and it sounds grim, but it's the reality we face, and now is the time to resolve what it means to take care of the people you work with, even when they're not in their usual place of work. We're in this together, so reach out if you would like to talk. Even if we don't end up working together, we'd love to help you think through what you and your organization needs to do to take advantage of this opportunity to change. Thank you all for attending, and take care, and have a great day.